Today is probably going to be a gloomy afternoon in Tenerife because contrary to its peaceful appearance, this small airport in the Canary Islands is unusually crowded and bustling. This seemingly harmless thing turns out to be an ironic arrangement of fate.
We will take off now.
The captain started the plane to rush forward, but they could not have expected that in the middle of the runway, another giant plane was gradually appearing, making the captain jump in surprise.
Who the hell is this? Get out of here!
In a moment, two Boeing 747s carrying more than 600 passengers were burned, terrifyingly haunted and deadly. The most unforgettable past of the Dutch national airline and the airline considered a glorious symbol of America was once again recreated. What happened in the end? What was the cause of the tragedy, the pilot, the air traffic control station? Who is responsible for this incident? Don't keep you waiting. Let's find out now about the accident considered the most catastrophic in the history of the world's aviation industry. KLM 4805 and Pan Am 1736, the fateful flights. Two 10 a.m., March 27, 1977, Tenerife Airport, Spain. The thick fog seemed to cover the entire space of the airport. On the runway at that time, there was a series of planes waiting to take off. This situation happened because in addition to the regular flights, Tenerife also had to receive many flights that were diverted from Gran Canaria International Airport in Spain because there had just been a terrorist bombing that injured one person. Immediately after that, the airport director received another anonymous call that there would be a second bomb. Due to security concerns, at least 5 large aircraft were diverted and landed successfully in Tenerife, including the fateful reunion of 2 Boeing 747s, the world's largest passenger aircraft at the time. The first Boeing was a 747-121 operated by Pan American Airways on Flight 1736, which had just landed after a long journey from Los Angeles. On board the plane were a total of 380 passengers and 16 crew members. The captain of the flight was Victor Grubbs, 56 years old. He was an experienced pilot with 21,043 flight hours, most of which were on Boeing 707s. As for the 747, he had only recently switched to this aircraft and had only accumulated 564 flight hours. The first officer was Robert Bragg, 39 years old. In addition, the flight crew also had an engineer, George Warnes, 46 years old. Previously, when informed of the incident in Gran Canaria, the crew of Pana 1736 requested to circle in the air to wait for landing, but the terrorist situation there was not yet fully under control, so the airport refused the request. Parked right in front of Pan Am was a more advanced version of the Boeing 747-206B, operated by the Dutch national airline on Flight 4805, which landed after departing from Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport. There were a total of 235 passengers and 14 crew members on board, including Captain Jacob Veldhuisen van Zanten, 50 years old, who had worked for KLM since 1951. Jacob was considered a model for pilots because of his mental strength and experience, having accumulated 11,700 flight hours before, with 1,545 hours flying on the Boeing 747. The first officer was Klaus Meers, 42 years old, who joined Flight 4805 as a supervisor and learned 747 flying experience from the captain. In addition, the crew also included a flight engineer, Willem Schroeder, 48 years old. Because the structure of Tenerife Airport has only one runway and a large parallel runway connected by 4 small runways, but having to accommodate so many giant planes at the same time, it quickly fell into a state of overload. The runway could no longer be used to guide the planes. Instead, planes wanting to take off had to perform the backtrack technique, which means running on the runway and then turning around to fly up, and this accidentally became the source of the tragedy. While waiting, the KLM captain decided to take advantage of the time for the passengers to disembark the plane to refuel. Instead of waiting until Gran Canaria, he did so partly because of the Dutch government's strict regulations on rest and landing times. If he landed too late, the captain would be responsible for the flight, and it would even involve legal issues. But unfortunately, things did not seem to be in his calculations. As soon as the refueling began, the air traffic controller announced that the situation at Gran Canaria was safe, and the planes could return there. There was nothing more KLM could do to delay takeoff, and for at least another 35 minutes, the consequences of this also affected the takeoff of the Pan Am that was right behind it. The Pan Am 1736 crew had considered flying around KML to take off, but due to a lack of 3.7 meters to keep a safe distance from KLM, and because the space was so tight, they finally had to stop and wait. The entire 600-plus people on both flights could not have imagined that these were the last moments of their lives. The final moments. 4 hours and 56 minutes after completing the loading of 55,000 liters of fuel, KML was instructed by air traffic control to run the length of the runway and then turn 180 degrees to takeoff position. The passengers were gathered to return to the plane. This process took quite a while because a female Dutch passenger had completed the procedures to stay because this was her original place of residence. Six minutes later, at 5:02 a.m., the Pan Am was also instructed by the air traffic control tower to run behind the KLM on the runway and then turn to the third small runway to get to the large runway parallel to the runway. There, Pan Am 1736 had to stop to wait for the KLM to take off before it could take its turn. Because the signal was too weak, the crew could not hear clearly the ATC request for runway number 1 or number 3, because they were pronounced similarly, so the Pan Am co-pilot asked again.
ATC, please repeat. Which runway number? Runway 3123. Runway 3.
After the call, the captain started to slowly run the Pan Am down the runway in the fog. The crew had a hard time identifying runways C1 and C2, but they could not identify runway C3 because the paint on the sign had almost faded due to the weather, but it had not been repaired. After reaching the end of the runway, the pilot decided to turn 45 degrees to runway C4, which they saw. Towards the KLM flight. At 5:04, it had already gone all the way to the end of the runway and had turned back. At this time, outside the center of the windshield, a layer of fog covered the view, reducing visibility to less than 300 meters. The bad weather, along with the mistake that had taken a lot of time, further urged the captain to take off immediately. He had just started to release the throttle when the first officer quickly stopped him.
Wait, we haven't received the air traffic control order yet. Okay, you, call them DOT. ATC KLM 4805 is ready. Take off.
There is a worrying fact that because they were not equipped with ground radar, air traffic controllers were forced to observe with the naked eye. But even they could not clearly see the planes they were controlling due to bad weather. They believed that at this time the Pan Am had turned onto runway number 3, so they spoke over the radio.
KLM 4805. You are cleared by Papa Beacon, then climb and maintain at flight level 90, turn right after takeoff. Continue on course 40 until intercepting radial 325 from Las Palmas VOR.
However, it should be noted that ATC had not yet granted permission for KLM 4805 to take off, but had only given flight instructions to the crew. But due to a miscommunication with ATC, the first officer responded that, "Now we will go." At the same time, the captain also said in an annoyed voice, "Let's go," because he was too impatient because all the planes were using the same frequency. So this announcement scared ATC and Pan Am, and before anyone could respond anything, just finished speaking at 5:06, the captain began to release the brake and pull the engine accelerator. The KLM glided at a speed of 260 kilometers per hour towards Pan Am, which was just 1,400 meters ahead of the runway. In an effort to clear up the confusion and ensure that KLM was still in its rightful place, the Pan Am first officer sent a signal saying, "We are still moving on the runway." At the same time, ATC also sent a message to KLM. "OK, point 4085, wait for takeoff." The simultaneous response from ATC and Pan Am accidentally caused radio interference. Because as mentioned before, this was 1977, communication was still primitive. All planes had to contact ATC through a frequency. So when two or more devices used the frequency at the same time, the sound would be interfered, creating an unpleasant noise. As a result, KLM could not hear the signal from Pan Am. They only heard one word, "Okay." More dangerous KLM also did not respond to the signal they received, so both ATC and Pan Am thought that was similar to approval. If either message had been relayed correctly, it would have alerted the KLM crew, and it would have been a beautiful day in Tenerife. But the angel of death had chosen them to return to God today, and there was no changing it. 10 seconds later, the KLM began to accelerate to the top. ATC sent a message to the Pan Am. "Pan Am 1736 reporting when the runway is ready. Understood. We will notify when the runway is clear." The KLM captain and first officer seemed to ignore this signal while the engineers seemed to have noticed the problem. Why would they tell Pan Am that? Where is it anyway? Never mind, we're taking off now. As the most inexperienced member of the KLM crew, the engineer's words carried no weight. And then what had to happen happened. 5 hours, 6 minutes, 50 seconds. The world's worst aviation disaster. Cruel fate happened when the Pan Am had just exited the runway. At that moment, the KLM rushed towards it. 5:06:45 a.m. When he looked out the window and saw a giant metal bird flying towards him, Captain Victor Grubbs screamed, "Damn it! Who the hell is this? Get out! Get out of here!" With all his might, Captain Victor Grubbs tilted the controls in an attempt to steer the plane towards the edge of the runway to avoid a collision. Meanwhile, Van Zanten on the KLM, when he saw the Pan Am, understood that it was too late to stop. Just 5 seconds later. Two giant Boeing 747s collided with a loud explosion. The front wheel of the KLM plowed through the cockpit of the Pan Am. The left engine and the remaining wheel set hit the upper right side of the Pan Am, almost tearing it in two. After the collision, the KLM still flew for a few more seconds before falling onto the runway and sliding about 300 meters. The strong impact caused the fuel tank that had just been filled to burst into flames like a fireball with no way out for them. All 324 passengers and 14 crew members were killed. On the Pan Am side, the plane also caught fire a few seconds after the collision. 335 passengers, including the flight attendants, all died in the fire. Those sitting in the nose of the plane, along with that, the captain and co-pilot climbed down the left wing of the Pan Am. However, there was no way to help them get to the ground because the distance between the plane and the ground was up to 4 meters. Ironically, the firefighters were later gathered, but they only saw the KLM on fire without noticing that right there, 450 meters away, there was another plane that was also damaged. There was no other way. 70 people on the Pan Am had to risk their lives to jump down to escape. Initially, all of them survived, but later 9 passengers died due to severe injuries. Immediately after the incident, about 70 investigators from Spain, the Netherlands, the United States, and 2 airlines launched a large-scale investigation to find out the cause of the tragic accident. The investigation concluded that the main reason for the accident was that Captain Van Zanten took off before permission, a fatal mistake because he wanted to leave as soon as possible to avoid violating KLM's working hours regulations and before the weather turned worse. After much controversy, the Dutch national airline finally had to admit that their crew was responsible for the incident and agreed to pay $110 million in compensation to the relatives of the unfortunate people. Besides, there are many indirect causes leading to the heartbreaking incident that make people regret and exclaim, if only there was no terrorist attack. If only Pan Am had been allowed to circle in the air and then land as originally scheduled at Gran Canaria Airport. If only KLM had not delayed takeoff to refuel. If only the radar signal could have been better. If only the weather had not been so bad in Tenerife. Or if the air traffic control station could have postponed all flight schedules until the weather conditions stabilized again. As a result of the accident, far-reaching changes were made to international aviation regulations. The world's aviation authorities made standard phrases mandatory and placed greater emphasis on English as a common working language. The word OK was abolished and the phrase off takeoff was only used when the runway was cleared and a formal takeoff clearance was given. Cockpit procedures were also changed. The hierarchical relationship between crew members was abolished, emphasizing the importance of coordination between crew members to make final decisions. Large memorials were also built later in both the Netherlands and the United States to mourn and remember the unfortunate victims. May they always be happy in heaven.